The Trinka podcast, academic writing done right. Hi, my name is Dr. KK and I'm thrilled to welcome you to yet another episode of the Trinka podcast where we discuss large language models. So, a confession first up. I'm a big science fiction fan and I love hard science fiction. So last month I read this novel called Blind Sight by Peter Watts, my first Peter Watts novel, and you can see the cover on your screen on the right hand side right now. And the story is basically something like this. About 100 years into the future, maybe in the late 21st century, a group of humans are sent to explore an entity on the outer edge of the solar system, and they reach there, and the group also includes a linguist. Just because you need to know this information so that the rest of the story makes sense. And as soon as they reach there, this entity gets in touch with the human group and talks in human earthly languages like Chinese and English and stuff like that. And the group, the people who are there to explore, they are confused. They don't understand what is happening. So eventually the linguist does some experiments in terms of talking to this entity, just like how we would talk to, let's say, some of the chatbots that we have to use these days, and eventually finds out some aberrations, some artifacts in the way that the entity is corresponding with the humans, and eventually they get to learn that this is actually a generative language model, much like ChatGPT. And I thought it was a fascinating sort of a premise of a science fiction story, and when I read it, I immediately thought that I don't understand what language models are, at least in the depth that I would have liked to, and that is the reason why we have this episode. We are taking up the challenge of demystifying language models. What are they and how do they work? So this episode is structured as follows. First, we take a quick introduction segment about these models, then we'll try to understand them a little better before looking at some applications, and then the very relevant ethical considerations surrounding their use. Then we'll try to quickly summarize the pros and cons and then leave you with some parting thoughts. So let's start with a short introduction of the topic, especially for those who have not yet explored the concept in detail. Language is one of the most fundamental tools of communication. It allows us to express our thoughts, feelings, and ideas with one another. However, as we increasingly rely on technology in our daily lives, our interactions with language have become more and more complex. We are surrounded by AI-based tools, including algorithms that make smartphone camera captures look sharp and textured, and those that recommend our next watches or listens on YouTube and Netflix. In fact, predictive text is probably the most common AI-based tool that we've all interacted with, a perfect segue to exploring what language models are themselves. So what are language models? Language models are powerful algorithms that enable computers to understand and generate human language. They have revolutionized the way we interact with technology, from predictive text on our phones, language translation models, to virtual assistants like Siri and the device behind me, I cannot say its name, from those to language translation software and predictive text on our smartphones. So, disclaimer before we move ahead. The disclaimer is regarding the use of the word understand in the context of AI, and it's very controversial, and the consensus is that the depth of human understanding cannot be matched by the current AI tools. But I'll continue to use the word considering that it is the simplest word to communicate the meaning in this context. Now that is out of the way, let's start with understanding language models a little more in detail. Language models are a type of artificial intelligence algorithm that enable computers to understand and generate human language. At their core, language models are fed a huge amount of data and are designed to predict the probability of a particular sequence of words occurring in a given context. For example, if you type in "a cup of" on your smartphone, you'll get suggestions on what the next word might be. And in my case, I'm looking for coffee. Similarly, if you type in "I watched a show on," you'll likely get a suggestion for Netflix or something like that. And this is the basis for predictive text models. There are several types of language models, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. One of them is a rule-based model, which uses a set of predefined rules to analyze and generate language. For example, a rule-based language model might be programmed to recognize certain grammatical patterns or sentence structures. Another type of language model is a statistical model, which uses statistical techniques to analyze language data and make predictions about which words are likely to occur next. Statistical models can take into account a wider range of factors such as the frequency of word usage and the context in which the words are being used. In recent years, deep learning models have emerged as a powerful tool in the field of natural language processing, otherwise known as NLP. These models use neural networks to analyze large amounts of text data, allowing them to learn complex patterns and relationships between words. Deep learning models are often able to achieve higher levels of accuracy than other types of language models, especially when working with large and complex data sets. Now, building a language model involves several steps, including selecting an appropriate data set, pre-processing the data to remove noise and irrelevant information, and selecting an appropriate algorithm to analyze the data. Once the model is built, it must be trained on a large amount of text in order to learn the patterns and relationships between words. However, building an accurate language model is not without its own challenges. One major challenge is dealing with the ambiguity of human language. For example, I saw her duck could either mean that your friend has a pet bird or she's getting out of the way of a punch that you're throwing at her. Words can also have multiple meanings depending on the context in which they are being used. For example, we found a bat could be an exclamation uttered by a scientist in a cave searching for the origins of a pandemic, or by children finding something that they've been looking for in their messy closets. Also, sentences can be structured in many different ways, and Yoda speak is a classical example. So, the Mandalorian is wonderful versus wonderful, the Mandalorian is. Now, language models must be able to recognize these complexities in order to make accurate prediction. Some other well-known issues include, but are not limited to, the propagation of bias, which is perpetuation of stereotypes depending on the training data set, or the so-called hallucination, which is factually invalid statements that are not rooted in any factual information in the training data set, and aspects such as toxicity, which is a lack of control on the amount of generated inflammatory content, especially if the prompt itself is inflammatory, and finally gendering, which is ascribing a gender when there is no need for the same. Starting the segment, application of language models. They have a wide range of applications. For example, in the field of natural language processing, which is a subfield of AI that focuses on enabling computers to understand, interpret, and generate human language. Some common applications of language models in NLP include speech recognition, machine translation, and sentiment analysis. Now let's take a look at all of these things in a little more detail. Speech recognition is perhaps one of the most well-known applications for language models. By analyzing the acoustic signals produced by the human voice, like things that I'm saying right now, language models can transcribe spoken words into text. This technology has revolutionized the way we interact with our devices, especially our smart assistants, enabling us to perform tasks such as sending messages, making calls, and searching the internet using just our voice. Obviously, you can also start a playlist or order something from Amazon using these language models these days. Another important application of language models is machine translation. Machine translation uses language models to automatically translate text from one language to another, just like the universal translator in Star Wars and Star Trek and everything. This technology has become increasingly important in our globalized world, enabling people to communicate across language barriers more easily than ever before. Now, these can also be used for sentiment analysis, which involves analyzing the emotional tone of a piece of text. By analyzing the words and phrases used in a given text and in that context, LMs can determine whether the text is positive, negative, or neutral in tone. And this technology is commonly used in social media monitoring and customer service applications, allowing companies to quickly identify and respond to customer feedback, as well as to detect hate speech, bias, and toxic language. Now, in addition to these applications, language models are also used in a variety of other contexts, such as text classification, question answering, and summarization. If you have ever used ChatGPT, you know that all of this is done wonderfully well there. These technologies are used in a wide range of industries, including finance, healthcare, and education, as well as in academic publishing. Now, while the use of language models has many benefits, there are also some limitations to consider. One major limitation is the inability of the language models to truly understand the meaning behind human language. Language models rely on statistical patterns and relationships between words, but they do not have an understanding, and they do not quite understand the text that they analyze or generate. And this can lead to errors and misunderstandings, especially in the complex and ambiguous contexts. It's time to discuss some ethical considerations with the use of language models. As with any technology, the use of language models raises a number of ethical concerns that must be addressed. Some of the most significant ethical considerations include bias, privacy, and accountability. Bias is a major concern when it comes to language models. They are only as unbiased as the data that they are trained on. If the data used to train a language model is biased, the model itself will be biased, leading to inaccurate or unfair results. For example, language models trained on datasets that overrepresent or underrepresent certain demographics may be more likely to generate biased or discriminatory results. And it's very common in, for example, in the field of justice, etc., when photographs are being scanned. Now, this is particularly concerning when it comes to applications like hiring or credit decisions, where biased language models can lead to unfair outcomes, and issues have been reported with bias in AI recruitment tools for justice enforcement, and political propaganda. Privacy is another important ethical consideration. Language models can be used to analyze large amounts of text data, raising concerns about how this data is collected, stored, and used. Privacy concerns can arise when language models are used to analyze personal data, such as social media posts or email messages. Now, companies that develop such models must take steps to ensure that the data that they collect and they use to analyze or train the model is protected and used responsibly. Accountability is also an important consideration. As language models become more integrated into our daily lives, it is important to consider who is responsible for their actions. If a language model generates biased or unfair results, who is responsible really? Should the responsibility lie with the company that created the model, or the individual users who rely on it to generate the result and then pass it on, or some other third party? Now, this is something that we have to ponder. Some examples include ethical issues related to self-driving cars, copyright controversies regarding AI-generated or copied content ranging from visual arts to programming code. Now, there are ongoing efforts to address these ethical concerns. For example, researchers are developing techniques for detecting and mitigating bias in language models. Companies are also implementing privacy policies and data protection measures to ensure that user data is used responsibly. And organizations are working to establish standards and best practices for the responsible development and use of language models. As AI and generative models continue to advance and evolve, governments and regulatory authorities around the world are starting to consider the need for regulation to ensure responsible and ethical use of these models. The development and deployment of these technologies raise concerns related to privacy, bias, and safety, and that must be addressed. Government regulation can also help ensure that AI and generative models are used in a way that benefits the society as a whole without causing harm or perpetuating discrimination. Let's quickly try to enlist the pros and cons of language models and their use. First of all, the good stuff. Language models are very good at identifying trends and patterns, and they can be highly automated. This will show constant incremental improvements as they are fed with more and more information. They can also intake multiple types of data and have potentially limitless scope for applications. Now, these are the good things. Now, let's look at the bad stuff. The quality of language models is heavily dependent on the data that they are trained on, and it takes time and a lot of computational resources to build one. The interpretation of results may be problematic and will need a human touch. Finally, they have several limitations such as errors, bias, among others, and the ethical concerns surrounding their use need to be addressed. Now, let's end this episode with some final thoughts. So in this episode, we've explored what language models are, their applications, and the ethical considerations that arise with their use. As language models become more and more advanced and are integrated into our lives, it is important to consider the ethical implications of their use. Ultimately, they have the potential to transform the way we live and interact with technology and with each other. But as with any technology, it is important to consider the ethical implications. By taking steps to address these concerns, we can ensure that language models are developed and used in a responsible and ethical manner. Developers, researchers, and policymakers must work together to ensure that language models are developed and used in a responsible manner. In addition to the points that we've covered, there are many other avenues of exploration when it comes to these. Researchers are continually developing new techniques for improving the accuracy and performance of these models, as well as exploring new applications and use cases. As the field of NLP continues to evolve, language models will play an increasingly important role in enabling computers to understand, interpret, and generate human language. And as listeners and as learners, it is important to stay informed about these developments and to engage in conversations about ethical implications of language models and any other technology use case. By doing so, we can help ensure that these technologies are used in the way that they're intended to. They do good things and do not have too many bad side effects. And that's our responsibility to the society. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Trinka podcast, where we discuss language models. We hope you liked this. If you did, please share the content with your family, friends, and colleagues, and let us know what you would like us to cover in future episodes. We definitely have a ChatGPT, its effect, its impact on academic publishing coming up as an episode. We have planned for it. We are hoping to release it as a next episode. This is Dr. KK signing off for the Trinka podcast, Academic Writing Done Right, and I'll see you in the next one.